Okay. Hello, everyone. I've shared a PowerPoint presentation, which you may prefer to look at rather than my face. There's not going to be a huge amount of information on there. It's mostly a map and different variants of a map because there's a lot of place names I'm going to be throwing out at you, and it's useful to, have a visual aid for that, I suppose. But let's get into it. So, Charles II was defeated at the Battle of Worcester on the 3rd of September 1651, and for the next 42 days he was on the run. Because of time constraints, I won't be covering every part of his escape. It's all very dramatic. He meets so many people, and it would take forever. But as you can see on the map on the screen, if it clicks, okay, good. So yes, I think Eugene's mentioned it on the thing. If you click the pin, you'll be able to see it in full screen, which I'm currently doing. His trip took him throughout most of the Midlands and a lot of southwest England. As you might expect, fleeing for his life made quite an impression on the young king, and it became one of his favourite stories to tell later in his life. Samuel Pepys, of diary fame, and the Earl of Clarendon both recorded what the king told them, and Pepys planned to publish it. This map is from To Catch a King by Charles Spencer, a very good book, which acted as my main source for this talk. Immediately after the battle, Charles returned to the house where he'd been staying. On the screen, you can see a plaque which claims that building, which is now a pub in Worcester, was where the king lived. I actually lived right across the street from it. I could see it through my kitchen window. And I can tell you that no one really knows for sure which house Charles stayed in, if that's even the same house, but they have a plaque, so that's basically proof. They also serve really nice pies if you ever do visit. But anyway, whichever house it was, Charles's escape almost ended before it began. The victorious parliamentary troops stormed the city, and they quickly learnt where the king had been staying. Charles ran out the back door just as the soldiers came in the front. And that's just a nice picture of Worcester Cathedral. So after fleeing Worcester, Charles fled north in the company of about 60 officers, most of whom wanted to make a mad dash for the Scottish border. The king disagreed. He preferred to make for London, where he hoped he'd be able to blend in with the capital's large population, and it's one of the busiest ports in Europe, so he hoped he'd find a ship to the continent. Once the royal party reached White Lady's Priory, which I've circled there, a house of one of the royalist officers, the king donned his first disguise. He became a farm labourer, quote, in leather doublet, a pair of green breeches and a jump coat of the same green, an old grey greasy hat without a lining, and a noggin shirt of the coarsest linen. To complete the look, Charles's famous hair was cut short on top with a pair of sheep shears, but he left it long on the sides. Of course, it wouldn't make much sense for a common farm labourer to have an escort of 60 cavalry officers, so from here on, Charles would travel with only a few companions, mostly Lord Wilmot, to better avoid attention. Lord Wilmot will be throughout Charles's journey, and he's a character all in his own right. The rest of his escort had only recently left the White Lady's estate when a company of parliamentarian soldiers arrived searching for royalist survivors of the battle. Charles hid in a nearby wood in the pouring rain as his hosts convinced the soldiers that the king had already left. He later said that while the rain was miserable, it probably stopped the tired, exhausted soldiers from spending too much time searching the area. But before Charles departed, his hosts attempted to teach the king how to speak like a local and how to not walk like a king. Charles eventually left White Ladies, attempting to cross the River Severn and get into Wales, but every crossing of the river was heavily guarded, so he returned to a neighbouring estate at Boscobel House. But also returning to the estate were the parliamentary soldiers, who began combing the area for the king. So Charles and a Colonel William Careless hid up an oak tree for an entire day. Charles, who was exhausted by this point, he fell asleep, and Colonel Careless wasn't careless with his royal charge. He held the sleeping king as long as he could, and when his strength began to fail him, he resorted to pinching the king to wake him up without alerting the soldiers below. This is, by the way, why so many pubs in England are called the Royal Oak. Charles spent many nights and some days hiding in the priest holes of the local Catholic gentry, as his hosts were interrogated by parliamentarian soldiers who knew of their royalist leanings. The context of the Civil Wars, the Puritans, very anti-Catholic, meaning Catholics tend to be quite fond of royalists. And it was a stereotype that often was true. But the plan once again changed. He wasn't going to try and get to London or the Scottish border or to Wales. Now Charles aimed to reach Bristol. He changed disguise, becoming the servant to the sister of another royalist officer, and the sister's name is Jane Lane, who had received permission to travel to visit a friend. This was an important and valuable document because in wartime there were heavy restrictions on a lot of people, but especially people with royalist sympathies. So having someone who had permission, if they were ever stopped, was invaluable. Now again, Charles had to be coached about the role he'd play, the correct etiquette for a servant, how he should refer to Lady Jane, what would be expected of him. Then they departed, Charles and Jane on the same horse, him riding the horse for his mistress. When they reached Bromsgrove, they realized that the mount had lost a shoe. So Charles, in his role as the servant, obediently took the horse to the blacksmith to have a new one attached. He later told Samuel Pepys, quote, "As I was holding my horse's foot, I asked the smith what news. He told me that there was no news that he knew of, since the good news of the beating of the rogues of the Scots. I asked him whether there was none of the English taken that joined with the Scots. He answered he did not hear if that rogue, Charles Stuart, were taken, but some of the others, he said, were taken. I told him that if that rogue, Charles Stuart, was taken, he deserved to be hanged more than all the rest for bringing in the Scots, upon which he said I spoke like an honest man, and so we parted." When the king reached the town of Wootton Wowen, they came across a company of dismounted parliamentary cavalry. The group had to decide quickly whether they were going to try and avoid them or if they were going to just march right through them. Judging that steering away from them would be suspicious, they decided to go straight through them, and they exchanged pleasantries, and they just seemed like ordinary travelers, even though there was a price on the king's head, and none of the soldiers noticed. That night, that's Wootton Wowen, I think, highlighted on the map. That night, the party spent at the house of Lady Jane's cousin. And in order to keep up the disguise, their new hosts were not told that the king was the king. So the hosts sent Lady Jane's servant to the kitchens, because of course they did. He was just a servant. But Charles was useless in a kitchen. He had no idea how to cook. He had no idea how to clean. He'd probably never done either in his entire life. And the cook told him to go and turn the jack, which spun meat on a spit over the fire. Charles almost broke the thing. He turned it the wrong way. It caused an awful screeching noise and got everyone's attention. And the cook was furious because she asked him, "What countryman are you, that you know not how to wind up a jack?" Charles managed to cover for his lack of experience by explaining that his family was too poor to have meat, so he never used a jack. It convinced the cook, and it also shows how the king was now more than ever aware of the reality of life for many of his poorest subjects. He'd spent more time among them over the last few weeks than ever before, after all. After leaving the next day, yes, that's just the unhighlighted map. After leaving the next day, the party stayed at an inn, and the following day, they reached the home of George Norton. The plan remained to keep Charles's true identity a secret, and so he was introduced as Lady Jane's servant, William Jackson. But a moment of crisis struck when Charles recognized the Nortons' butler, John Pope, to be a former servant of his own when he was a boy, and who had served in the royalist cavalry of his father. But despite everything, Charles's disguise held up. Pope didn't recognize him, and Lady Jane asked that her man, Jackson, be taken somewhere to sleep off a fever, and Pope took the king to his quarters to rest. The next morning, Charles enjoyed a breakfast of bread and butter with the other servants, and then they were joined by a veteran of the Battle of Worcester. Again, Charles was not recognized, despite the man having fought for him just a few weeks earlier. The king decided to play with fire at this point and asked the soldier what the king was like. He was then given an exact description of what he'd been wearing at the battle and was then told that the king was at least 3 fingers taller than Jackson. Charles then decided he'd better make himself scarce before the soldier noticed any other similarities, and he left the room with Pope. As he did so, the lady of the house walked by, and, remembering his training, Charles doffed his hat. Pope, now seeing him without it for the first time, immediately recognized him, and the royal party decided that the butler had to be trusted. Charles admitted his identity to Pope, and Pope gladly joined the escape attempt. He was sent to nearby Bristol to find a ship that was bound for Spain or France, but returned to report there weren't any due for at least another month. Instead, the group rowed to the south coast. Hearing word that a ship was sailing to Brittany from the port of Yarmouth, Charles entered the town alongside the young niece of the royalist Lady Wyndham. Their cover story, if they were stopped, was that they were eloping to get married. But once in Yarmouth, the captain didn't turn up. He had apparently been locked in his bedroom by his wife, who didn't want him getting mixed up in anything dangerous. So the next day, Charles and his eloping bride-to-be travelled 7 miles east to Bridport. Their flight from Yarmouth could not have come sooner. A blacksmith, who had been summoned to fit new shoes to the party's horses, noticed that one of them bore shoes smithed at Worcester, and he'd immediately reported it. The parliamentary garrison arrived to arrest the suspected royalists, but they'd already fled. It looked like Charles had got out of the frying pan and into the fire, because when they reached Bridport, they found the town swarming with parliamentary soldiers. An entire army was mustering there in preparation for an attack on the island of Jersey, one of the last remaining strongholds of the royalist cause in England. The sheer number of soldiers spooked some members of the party, but Charles decided that turning round would be suspicious. And so they boldly marched through a courtyard full of redcoats to reach an inn. Charles, again following his chosen role, took the horses to the stable. And he wasn't sneaking. He made a point of getting in the way. He knocked into enemy soldiers and just played the part of a bumbling, humble servant. Again, the king came close to discovery when he met yet another figure from his past in the stable, but he managed to convince the man that he'd served an old neighbour of his. The party moved on the next day, spending the night at Broad Windsor. Like Bridport, Broad Windsor was full of enemy soldiers. Charles and friends booked the last room in the George Inn at the very top of the building, with parliamentary officers taking up most of the other rooms. They became much safer when another guest suddenly went into labour, and the soldiers decided that they just didn't want to deal with that racket and went somewhere else to sleep. It was while staying here that the fugitives learned that the captain they had arranged a deal with, who'd been locked in his house by his wife, had now backed out of the plan altogether. He knew that whatever he was being paid to do was clearly incredibly dangerous, though he didn't know he would be smuggling a king. He now refused to take part, unwilling to risk his life and liberty. With that escape plan scuppered, the party left the George Inn and retreated to Trent House, the home of Colonel Francis Wyndham, where they'd previously stayed. But the net was closing in on the fugitives. Shortly after the king left the George Inn, and we're talking literally minutes after they rode off, a cavalry troop under the command of Captain Macy arrived. They'd followed the party from Yarmouth, where the blacksmith had reported his suspicions, and they asked around the inn about the fugitives. When they were informed that, yes, a group matching the description of the fugitives had been there and only just left for London, the cavalry mounted up and charged after them. Luckily for the fugitives, they charged the wrong way. Charles's party had wisely doubled back after appearing to head for London, and Captain Macy only turned around after he reached Dorchester 15 miles away. But this had still been an incredibly narrow escape, and the king's chances weren't improved as former allies turned on him. The reward for his capture was £1,000, an incredibly large sum for almost anyone. Throw in the consequences for having helped the king, execution for treason, and it's only surprising that it took so long for an ally to betray him, not that someone betrayed him at all. That traitor was Captain Ellersden, who had been part of the Yarmouth plan, but with its failure, seems to have decided that Charles had no chance and it was better to be on the winning side. He took off on his own pursuit of the fugitives and tried to convince other allies of Charles to help bring him in. Captain Macy soon returned, possibly on a tip-off from Ellersden, and he ransacked the home of Sir Hugh Wyndham, Captain Wyndham's uncle. At this point, the pursuers knew full well that they weren't just on the trail of some survivors from the Battle of Worcester. Macy declared that he was there to arrest Charles Stuart. Charles was at another Wyndham property, but that didn't stop an overexcited soldier from accusing one of Sir Hugh's daughters of being the king in disguise. Charles spent the next 12 days at Trent House as allies were found and a new plan of escape was worked out. Again, a ship was chartered to sail from a small hamlet near Southampton, but again, the looming parliamentary invasion of Jersey got in the way. The ship was requisitioned to carry soldiers, and yet another opportunity to escape the kingdom was taken away by chance. But all was not lost. On the 7th of October, another arrangement was made to smuggle Charles out of the kingdom. One Captain Nicholas Tattersall agreed to smuggle 2 men to France aboard his coal boat, the Surprise, for the sum of £80. He didn't know it yet, but those 2 men were Charles II and Henry Wilmot, the noble who'd stayed with Charles throughout almost his entire journey. Almost a week after this arrangement was made, during which Charles found the time to visit Stonehenge, Charles and Wilmot, along with 2 other companions, set off to meet with the captain. Their journey to Brighthelmston, now modern Brighton, was an eventful one. They spent a night with one of the royalist officers with them, Colonel Gunter. They stayed with his brother-in-law, who was a heavy drinker. Charles played yet another role, this time a Puritan, and he leaned into this by gently chiding his drunken host whenever he swore. His host was generous, though, and kept plying his guest with alcohol. While a very nice gesture, it was dangerous for the fugitive king, and so whenever his host was distracted, Charles poured some of his drink away or into the cups of his companions. Gunter got his king out of the situation by convincing his brother-in-law that if the uptight Puritan was just allowed to go to bed, they could all have more fun. Wilmot was quite happy to let the king go to bed, and he matched his host drink for drink, staying up late into the night. The next day, the party passed through a village to be faced by 50 cavalrymen charging down the street towards them. It looked like now, just miles away from safety, their time had run out. But, to the royal party's relief, the soldiers veered past them and down another street. Again, simply keeping their cool in the face of imminent discovery had kept the fugitives at large. The final obstacle in Charles's escape came once they reached Brighton, where they waited at another inn, also called the George, for Captain Tattersall. When the captain arrived, he was livid to find that one of his passengers was to be the fugitive king. That increased the stakes dramatically. It was one thing to smuggle a couple of royalist officers out of the country, it was quite another to commit the treasonous act of aiding Charles II. Tattersall made quite a scene, so much so that the innkeeper came over to the table. He too recognized that he had a once and future king as a customer. He had served in the royal household in the past and was much, much happier to see him than Tattersall was. Tattersall demanded to be paid even more now that he knew the danger. £200 would be his fee to be paid at a future date, provided Colonel Gunter swore to it. He certainly swore at him for the captain's opportunism, but when Tattersall wouldn't budge, the price was finally agreed. Late that night, at 2 a.m., the party left for Shoreham. They reached the Surprise soon after, and when the tide was high enough to cast off, Charles and Wilmot sailed out into the Channel at 7 a.m. Again, the parliamentarians had been close on their heels. Soldiers arrived at Shoreham 2 hours after the remaining members of the royal party left the town. They had narrowly missed their quarry. Charles and Wilmot would land in Normandy the next day, and after 6 weeks on the run, Charles II had finally escaped England. Thank you very much. I think throughout it, on the parliamentary side, for like a good week or so, they were convinced that Charles had died at the battle, and then once news finally got out that he was alive and they'd missed him, he'd got away. The papers went mad about. They blamed the Dutch. They said that the Dutch had helped. That wasn't true, but they didn't like the Dutch, so it made sense to them. For the rest of the royal family on the continent, they were obviously relieved because the last thing they'd heard was that the battle had been lost. They had heard nothing else other than that because how could they? Obviously, royalists were very, very happy. Um, and yeah, it's just it's a crazy story, and I don't think there's a lot of people who I think most people take what Charles has accounted as true. It doesn't seem like he embellished it that much, like over all the years. So um, I think there was enough. Well, put it this way: there was enough. This is after the Restoration. There was enough interest that Pepys was wanting to publish it, um, and he was aware enough that uh, you know it was worth quite a bit of money. That even when the king's brother asked for a draft, he begged off and was like, "No, no, no, I can't let you see that," just in case it got out, and he ended up losing his losing his windfall from it. Oh, there's. I would have to think that it's hard to say because I don't know when the. I would imagine that Cromwell learnt some of this because when Charles would have been, it's a fantastic story, so he would have told everyone. And Cromwell had very good spies. So I would imagine that some account of the oak tree or any of the times they just walked through soldiers made it to Cromwell and um, then made it down the parliamentary hierarchy, and they were like, "Ah, shit, I was in that town that day. Oh God, no." So I think for those who were still alive and active by the time the Restoration comes around and Charles's story gets more publicized, I think a lot of people would be kicking themselves. I don't know if they ever pieced it together like Pepys did. Pepys did this like in the 1680s, so it was quite some time afterwards. But yeah, I think I think they'd if they knew all the times, they'd be kicking themselves. What's that idea? I I haven't come across it. I don't know if it's a particularly like if there's a very strong argument for it, and I'm completely oblivious to it. But I can't imagine that. I think the lengths that the government went to try and get him, um, it would have to be a conspiracy on a whole extra level, because there are official like on the day he gets away, um, Parliament puts out a description of him and says, "Get this man. He is dangerous. If he gets away, the peace is in danger." Um, and I can't see a way that the government could do that and also like tell its officers to just let him go. I can't see a way that that hasn't come to light. And I would say they're much more interested in the efforts they go to catch him are much stronger than anything resembling like a. They're not playing with the kiddie gloves. They desperately want him. So I can't imagine that there were people in government wanting him to get out. Um, if he'd been captured, he'd be executed. I'm fairly certain that would be his fate. Um, Other officers who had come across with him, like Lord Derby, the Great Stanley, and Stanlack Moore of the Isle of Man, he left Worcester with Charles, and he was one of the officers that left and let Charles go on with his smaller party. He was captured. He was executed, just almost summarily because they he was guilty of treason, essentially, as the way the Parliament saw it, because he'd led a foreign army into England, um, and I think considering that they'd already set the precedent of killing kings, I think they would, yeah, there'd be a trial, and his head would come off. That would be it. I can't see them keeping him around as a totem of royalist resistance. They're certainly not going to let him go. He's already proven that he would invade. No, I think he'd be executed. And if he died, that's different. I don't know. Like that would just be it would change history basically. you would, I suppose now we have this idea of, okay, who, it's not like the modern royal family where we see their faces every day. There's photographs, we see them all the time. So yeah, I was quite surprised that so many people knew what he looked like. But I think it makes a little more sense because of how large the royal households were, and like how quickly some servants stayed for years, some didn't, and then they'd serve a bit and then they'd move on or whatever. So I'm in that sense, I can see why maybe it's just a coincidence that just on his route he seems to meet every servant he's ever had. But with his soldiers, he was quite hands-on, or at least because he had quite a small army when it came to Worcester. A lot of them would know him, and he's spent the last 10 years or so serving in the First Civil War. So the officers and cavalry of his father's army would know him by sight, and there was a lot more of them. So when they were all disbanded and they went about their ways, their new king, just wanders through the door, and it's just, yeah, I'm surprised more people didn't recognize him, honestly. I think a healthy dose of just respect for the great chain of being. The king is God's vice regent on earth. He's the idea that you could just kill a king or rebel against a king is just preached against the people of early modern England. It's just like it's monstrous. It's the worst thing you can possibly do. So there's a very, very strong respect and adoration of the king, and it would almost be the immediate default position. My sovereign, my monarch, is in trouble. I will help him. But for plenty of them, there's also the potential rewards. If you help a king at his worst, if he ends up back on the throne, which admittedly at the time looked unlikely, well, you're in a good chance for getting some rewards. If that's a pension, if that's just honors, if that's a title. Like Charles did remember a lot of the people that he met, and he did reward plenty of them. So I think it's a combination of that, just a general loyalty to the king. They're staying at royalist households, they're staying in Catholic households. Like, so the people who are already going to be there are they're not hardcore parliamentarians, but even so, like even other people unaffiliated with royalist households they're going to have a general base of royalism just drilled into them from birth, basically, that you respect the king, you help the king. And for those that wasn't enough, the king's got a lot of money. So I would imagine that it would, well, all the royalist hopes would then go to James, his younger brother, who had his own dramatic escape from England a few years previously. He was in the Tower when his dad was executed, and he managed to escape. But so he was at large on the continent. Whether the restoration would have occurred in the same way it did, I don't know. James II, I mean, he was deposed, so maybe he's not the best people person, and maybe I don't know how well known his Catholic sympathies were when he was younger. Maybe he wouldn't have them. Maybe he would keep that under wraps if he did, and then he would be invited back, and as his brother was in reality. But yeah, I would say it would stay as a royalist court in exile, centered around James, and presumably, all else being the same, James would also be invited back, and maybe the earlier ascension to the throne means that he doesn't get overthrown in this alternate timeline that he eventually is. I don't know. I think that's what would happen. James would end up being restored, and then after that, I don't know enough about him. I don't know enough about him to know whether he would immediately put his foot in it, or whether he would have a successful reign like his brother ended up doing. Yes, I think that's definitely. I mean, that's another one of the alt history things. Is like, what if Charles's older brother, Prince Henry, well, that wasn't Henry. Yes, it was Henry. If he hadn't died at an early age, what would he be like as a king? Because he was groomed for rule, whereas Charles suddenly had it thrust upon him when he was. I don't know if he was fully an adult, but he wasn't raised expecting to be king. And yeah, there's certain skills he definitely lacked. And I think yes, I think yeah, there's a good reason to think that James maybe didn't develop the best skills for kingship because he wasn't expected to rule. Because I mean, Charles ruled like he was restored in 1660. He dies in 85, and he has no true-born sons. He has plenty of bastards, but like, and he has plenty of lovers. But for some reason, he just never has a son. And yeah, I think it would have been interesting whether James taking over at an earlier age would have changed. Well, it would have changed things, but I'm curious about how much it would have. Yes, he did. But I think, I mean, I can't remember exactly how old Charles II is when he dies, but he's not ancient. Um, and there was a high probability that he would end up having a son anyway. James would have been heir presumptive, but he wasn't heir apparent. Um, and I think that's the key. Like, if Charles had a son, that's James out of the. Well, he's knocked down a peg in the succession law. Um, but I think even James would have thought, I'm probably not going to be king. Charles is probably going to have a son, and then increasingly he may have realized, oh, actually no, I'm probably going to be king. But at that point, he was in his 40s probably, um, and how much more training can you have at that point? He was the man he was at that point, and there's no you can't really change that at that point. I don't think they did. I think no, I don't. I don't. Printing wouldn't have been so they wouldn't. Printing wouldn't have been good enough quality, so they wouldn't have been able to do that. They would have. There would be like there would be prints of Charles, but it wouldn't be detailed. It would be okay. That's roughly his facial shape, and he's got long hair. Okay, that's not massively useful. I don't think they did like they actually replicated portraits by hand. Um, no, I think it was mostly that personal um, like experience of meeting him, and when you meet the king, the future king, you'd probably remember a fair bit about him, which is why it's quite surprising that so. I mean, the butler Pope only recognizing him when he took off his hat. It's like, okay, how blind do you have to be? Maybe it was just like he didn't expect to ever see a king there, and it was just I don't know. It's just it's quite odd. Um, Charles was 65 when he died. Yes. So again, like kings have had kids at that age. It's not particularly likely, but he could have done it. Um, but yeah, I'd like to think so. I don't know enough about his reign to say for sure. I would like to think that I touched on it a little bit in the paper. Um, I mean, what I didn't mention is like the first time he stays with one of the poor families, he demands mutton for dinner, and it's a poor family; they can't afford mutton. So the fact that later on he uses that as almost as part of a cover, hopefully, I know he's still a king, he's still going to be a king, but like I would hope that that would influence him a little bit to be a bit more, egalitarian and consider, his subjects do not do he is incredibly privileged, and hopefully this would have affected him. I mean, I think of the Great Fire of London. Him and his brother took charge of that, and they did try and help. They tried to ease the suffering. They did what they could. I don't know about the rest of the reign enough to say that, oh no, Charles was always a humanitarian after this and all that stuff, but it's got to have. It's certainly the Catholic, the aid of the Catholics definitely played a role. I mean, when Charles dies, the priest they get to give him his last rites and who takes his conversion to Catholicism, he dies a Catholic, is a priest he met on his flight. So like James brings him, says, Father, Sire, this man once saved your life. Let him now save your soul. And Charles remembers him, and he dies a Catholic. And I've got to imagine that seeing the generosity and the loyalty of his Catholic subjects, definitely, it must have had an impact. It has to have. Yeah, I'll drop into the meeting room. I don't want to be a hypocrite after all day cutting people off at the exact time. I can't be a hypocrite and be like, no, I want a few more minutes. No, I'll go into the meeting room. I'll be my admin. Fantastic.